So good afternoon. I'm Michael Rothberg, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event with my colleague, Rachel Deblinger, who will be speaking about her new book, Saving Our Survivors: How American Jews Learned About the Holocaust. This talk is made possible by the 1939 Society Program in Holocaust Studies. We hope you can join us at many more Levy Center events this year, and you can find more information on other upcoming programs at the registration table near the entrance of the room. As always, I want to thank our wonderful Levy Center staff for making the arrangements for today's event. They make everything possible. And let me ask you to take a moment to silence your phones before we get started. I'm now going to introduce our speaker. Rachel Deblinger is a historian of the Holocaust and American Jewish life and a digital humanist. She's currently the director of the Modern Endangered Archives Program at the UCLA Library. Previously, she was a founding director of the UC Santa Cruz Digital Scholarship Commons, where she also held a postdoctoral fellowship in digital humanities and was a research program manager for a Mellon-based funded program at the Humanities Institute. Rachel received her PhD in history from UCLA, where she completed a dissertation that served as the basis for her new book, and worked with some of our fabulous colleagues in the Levy Center who are here today, including David Myers, Sarah Stein, and Todd Presner. As director of the Modern Endangered Archives Program, MEAP, Rachel is doing crucial work securing at-risk cultural heritage from dozens of countries around the world. MEAP has funded over 170 projects that help to preserve archives from more than 60 countries. By digitizing and documenting endangered archives, the Modern Endangered Archives Program and Rachel are providing a platform for narratives and voices that challenge nationalized and politicized accounts of the past. And I was fortunate to have the opportunity to learn about Rachel's work with the archive program when she came to my cluster class on political violence in the modern world and led us through some of the archive's fascinating holdings a couple years back. At the same time that Rachel has been doing critical work as an archivist in the library, she's also continued to produce important scholarship. Among her publications are a chapter on the early collector of testimony, David Boder, for a path-breaking collection edited by David Cesarani and Eric Sundquist called After the Holocaust, which challenged the long-standing belief that the first decades after World War II were a time of silence about the Holocaust. She also contributed to Todd Presner's book, Ethics of the Algorithm, co-authoring the conclusion with him, and she has a chapter forthcoming in the Oxford Handbook of American Jewish History. Finally, of course, we are here today to mark and celebrate the publication of Saving Our Survivors: How American Jews Learned About the Holocaust, which appeared this year from Indiana University Press in the series The Modern Jewish Experience. This original, compelling, and beautifully written book provides a new perspective on the public presence of the Holocaust in the United States during the early post-war years. I don't want to go into too much detail since Rachel will be introducing us to the book in a moment, but I can say that her focus on Jewish communal organizations and their role in bringing knowledge about the Shoah to American Jews and to a wider public in the first decade after the war offers a highly illuminating picture of a transitional moment before the meaning of the tragedy in Europe had solidified into a form that we would recognize today. In order to paint this picture, Rachel digs into archival sources that one would not ordinarily expect to find in a book on Holocaust memory, such as fundraising protocols, scripts for now largely forgotten radio programs, and projects supplying material aid to survivors in displaced person camps in Europe. The result of Rachel's exploration is both a new view of early Holocaust memory and an unexpected portrait of American Jews responding to a catastrophe that few people at the time could comprehend. So now, I ask you to please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Rachel Deblinger, who will talk about Saving Our Survivors.
Hi, everyone. Well, this is really exciting. Before I jump in, I really want to thank Viv and Chelsea and the center staff and everybody at the center for putting this together and welcoming me here today. I also want to thank Michael and the 1939 Club, not only for this event, but for all the events that I got to go to and learn from as a graduate student here for many, many years. And of course, David, Sarah, and Todd, who have read versions of this project for the last 20 years and still managed to show up here today, which I think is pretty remarkable. And then just to thank the center in general for their support of this project. I have been getting support for this work when I was a first-year graduate student up until last year to make sure that the book got finished and I was able to bring it all together. So I'm really grateful to share this with all of you. So it's not really a good way to jump in, so I'm just going to jump in. Saving Our Survivors explores a broad range of post-war Holocaust representation. I look at Jewish communal organizations and other national and humanitarian institutions that shaped and disseminated images and stories about Holocaust survivors across a range of media materials to mobilize a humanitarian and philanthropic response at the end of World War II. I focus particularly on the period 1945 to 1953, after which most displaced persons camps in Europe were closed and American Jewish communal aid largely shifted to Israel. If anyone is interested in that shift, we can talk about that in the Q&As. The book illustrates how American Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors first encountered stories about Jewish survivors of Nazism during this very liminal period, when American Jews were responding not only to the crisis of Jews in Europe, but also to the changing boundaries of Jewish life, global politics of the emerging Cold War, and the shifting communal norms in post-war America. The work is animated by a set of questions kind of distilled here. So the first, how did institutions and communal organizations that aided Jewish survivors craft narratives about the Holocaust? So in response to the humanitarian crisis of World War II, how did Jewish organizations engage, capture, reimagine, and then disseminate stories about the Holocaust survivors that they were interacting with in DP Europe? And then from the other side, from the American side, what kinds of stories did American Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors first encounter about the Holocaust? So how did they first start to understand not only the kind of individual stories, but the scale of the Holocaust and what happened in Nazi Europe? And then more broadly, the book really tries to contribute to a question about how Holocaust narratives have changed over time, particularly narratives that are expressed by and about survivors, recognizing a shift that placed survivors first on the periphery of the stories about the Holocaust, really now to the center of stories about the Holocaust. And I hope that the book as a whole helps us toggle back and forth between the specificity of the post-war period and the longer history of Holocaust memory in America. So even today, on the one hand, I'm very interested in the particular narratives of the post-war period, this short transformational period of time, and then also this longer story that traces how knowledge about the Holocaust and about Holocaust survivors has been and continues to be crafted, mediated, and defined both by survivors themselves and by the institutions that share and preserve their stories. So let's start with the post-war period. And it's fun because we're here. This was the title of my dissertation, In a World Still Trembling. And I think it's a helpful reminder that in the post-war period, Gisela Wazanski and Lola Kramartsky, who were the co-chairs of the Hadassah National Youth Aliyah Committee, wrote to all of the members of their organization in July 1945 that their work was taking place, quote, in a world still trembling with the impact of evils let loose upon the world by our enemies and the enemies of mankind. And so the trauma and shock of the Holocaust wasn't just a trauma that was facing survivors, but also American Jews and Jews around the world, and really all people around the world as they started to see the images that were coming out of concentration camps, out of Nazi Europe, both from Jewish organizations and from the armies that were also circulating these narratives. And again, I'll come back to that. So throughout this short period of time, Jewish survivors were really moving across post-war Europe. So there wasn't a kind of static community of survivors. In the immediate aftermath of the war, so in the spring and summer of 1945, roughly 10 million people were categorized as displaced persons. And Jews at the time made up only a very small percentage of this group. And as the liberating armies swept through Europe, the vast majorities of displaced persons that were in these occupied territories were repatriated. So by August 1945, it's like a very short period of time. So between June and August, there were only 1.5 million DPs remaining in this occupied area. So if we look at this map, there were actually quite a lot of displaced persons camps. And by this point, Jews made up a much larger percentage of the overall displaced persons because so many others had welcomed repatriation. And even for this community of Jewish survivors, there was a kind of coming and going across these displaced persons camps as people made their way out of hiding. They made their way back west from the Soviet Union. People who had been in various kinds of positions in Europe were finding their ways into displaced persons camp, seeking care, seeking their family, seeking community amongst other Jewish survivors. And it is this evolving group of survivors that Americans start to learn their stories. It's not only concentration camp survivors, right? It's this kind of broad, evolving community called the Sharit HaPlata, the surviving remnant, that inform how the story of the Holocaust was first communicated to American Jews. Because Jewish organizations were most closely affiliated with the people that were inside the displaced persons camps. Not exclusively, but primarily. And these stories were really much broader than we have kind of thought about in terms of Jews in the Holocaust, especially thinking about concentration camp survivors. So I'm starting with these historical details because it's important to note that the narratives circulating in post-war America were specific to this post-war period. They reflected life in the DP camp. All of these images are from displaced persons camps in Europe after the war. This liminal space and time when the surviving Jews of Europe waited for opportunities to rebuild their lives. These narratives and images often do not look or sound like survivor narratives that make up so much of our contemporary Holocaust memory. So if we imagine the videos, the exhibits of Holocaust museums all around the world, thinking about videotaped testimonies from the Shoah Foundation or the Yale Fortunoff Collection, or if we think about any of the new AI or computational projects that you might be familiar with, the narratives I'm going to highlight really are very different, and largely because they were trying to do something quite different. They weren't functioning as memorialization. They weren't trying to document or historicize. In fact, they were really working to activate American Jews. So these were narratives for action and advocacy, not preservation or documentation. But they are still, nonetheless, important for us to consider as part of the history of Holocaust memory in America, because they remind us that the Holocaust has taken on different meanings in American Jewish life over the past 8 decades, and will continue to do so today and into the future. So what did these Holocaust narratives look like in the immediate aftermath of the war? How were these narratives used to motivate a response to the post-war crisis, and how do they differ from the narratives we might be more familiar with today? So you can start to see here, this image on this side was from an annual report from the Joint Distribution Committee. There's this kind of lovely image of these happy, smiley people. And this is the original image out of Marseille of Jewish DPs leaving Europe. And so they were literally framed in the organizational structure. We're going to look specifically now at some fundraising and advocacy narratives before shifting into a number of radio broadcasts that kind of help us understand how survivor voices were first heard by American Jews. So this is a little peek of some different materials that were circulating in the late 1940s across America. And just to highlight a couple of the themes that we'll talk about again. First of all, these narratives focus on the needs of the 1940s, the food, the material goods. They also often feature children as centerpieces of survivors. Interesting thing about children being featured is that the number of children that survived was actually rather small of the overall number of Jews who'd survived in post-war Europe, but they were often the centerpiece of fundraising campaigns and material aid campaigns. These narratives also invited American Jews into the narrative, asking them for help that could only come from America. So you can start to see that here. And we can see this idea in particular in this statement from Joseph Schwartz in 1945 that American Jews had a responsibility to respond as never before. They were called on not only to help and support Jewish survivors, but to ensure that there would be a Jewish future. Schwartz was the head of the European activity for the Joint Distribution Committee at the time, and he was in post-war Europe, and he wrote that American Jews it's a paramount responsibility of the American Jewish community, a common understanding of reconstruction and rehabilitation on which we must set no limit on effort or cost. Right? So really a focus on fundraising as an urgent need in the post-war period, that the only way to really rebuild Jewish life was to fundraise like they'd never fundraised before. And in 1945 into 1946, organizations like the United Jewish Appeal called on American Jews to donate at one-time levels to meet the unprecedented crisis. The leaders of Jewish organizations were optimistic that the crisis of feeding and healing hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors could be completed in 1 year. This was definitely not the case, and communal leaders had to then repeatedly ask people to give at one-time only levels throughout this period. American Jews met that demand. In 1946, so you can see here the kind of goals that were set by the UJA. In 1946, UJA, which was the umbrella organization that raised funds for the Joint Distribution Committee, which performed aid and humanitarian work in Europe, for the United Palestine Appeal, which then became the United Israel Appeal, which did work in Palestine and then Israel, and the National Refugee Service, which then became the United Service for New Americans. There's like a lot of organizations. They're not super important to pay attention to, other than just that UJA was fundraising for humanitarian aid in all parts of the world. So in America, in Europe, and in Israel. And in 1946, they set an ambitious goal of raising $100 million. To give you a sense of just how ambitious this goal was, UJA had raised $100 million throughout the entire war. So between 1938 and 1945, UJA raised $100 million. In 1946, they said, we will again raise $100 million. The leaders themselves thought this was a ridiculous goal, and yet not only did they meet it, but they exceeded it. Records suggest that they raised $103 million in 1946. In 1947, they again exceeded their fundraising goal, raising over $150 million, and the totals remained over $100 million for the next 5 years, hitting over $200 million in 1948 after the State of Israel was founded. Just to give you another sense of how ridiculous this goal was in 1946, the Red Cross, an organization with more than 18 million members in the United States, also set a fundraising goal of $100 million, and they did not meet that goal in that year. Right? So there was something really spectacular about the scale of fundraising in 1946. And I'm like really underscoring this because a lot of the examples I'm going to show are one-off, and so it's easy to say like, oh, well, that was just one image, or no one was really viewing that. But the scale of the response suggests that these narratives were going into American Jewish homes and that people were responding to them. These fundraising narratives explicitly pulled at the heartstrings of American Jewish donors, relying on stories and images of children and campaigns that were specifically focused on children. So you can see here a number of these campaigns. The Our Child Survivor campaign was from Hadassah. These letter writing campaigns, many organizations created these adoption campaigns where groups of people would come together. They would be paired with one individual child and they would write letters back and forth. They would send money. There was, in fact, a UCLA chapter of one of these adoption programs where students would write letters to Jewish orphans in Europe. And this program at the bottom we'll come to again. It's called Supplies for Overseas Survivors, and it was a material aid program that sent millions of pounds of goods to Europe in the post-war period. And again, kind of underscoring that these materials could only come from America. Okay, American Jews were called on literally as the lifeline to Europe, and this is again from the Supplies for Overseas Survivors campaign. You can see all of the kinds of material goods that were collected. SOS collected, between 1947 and 1949, SOS collected 26 million pounds of relief goods from nearly 1,000 communities across the country. They sent 14 million pounds of food, 11 million pounds of clothes, 1 million pounds of medicine, and over 170,000 toys, enough for each surviving Jewish child to have at least one. So again, like the scale of this response was quite enormous. And the focus on material goods and on the role of America in providing aid echoed across the country. So I've showed you so far really Jewish-specific narratives, but these same ideas were circulating more broadly across America. In 1945, President Truman reported from the Potsdam Conference that the U.S. must win the peace, and that, quote, if we let Europe go cold and hungry, we may lose some of the foundations of order on which the hope for worldwide peace must rest. And so again, this idea was echoed by by Truman, and then also in this Saturday Evening Post article, World Relief is America's Job. So again, like the kinds of narratives that were circulating for American Jews were echoed and reinforced more broadly across the country, including in these material aid campaigns that were national campaigns. And you can see these images here of, again, featuring children who were not the majority of the victims of the war, and yet they were often used to pull at the heartstrings of not just American Jews, but Americans more broadly. The other set of narratives that I want to highlight from this time period were not fundraising campaigns. They were immigration advocacy campaigns. And so this is the brochure from the Citizens Committee on Displaced Persons, which was created in 1946 by the American Jewish Committee and the American Council for Judaism to advocate for suspended immigration quotas and temporary legislation. So if you are familiar with these organizations, you might note that these are both non-Zionist organizations, and American Jews who were non-Zionists were trying to advocate for better American immigration paths as a contrast to the work of Hadassah and other kinds of Zionist organizations. So all of these American Jewish narratives were kind of at a head within the way that the Holocaust was being talked about and circulated at the time. But one of the other examples here that is really fascinating is that the Citizens Committee on Displaced Persons center on this brochure that said, after the nightmare of Nazism and fascism, after the Holocaust of World War II, we owe it to ourselves and to the world to be the guardians of freedom and peace. So this brochure was from 1947, and they used the word Holocaust. It has a lowercase h, so clearly the term was around, it was in circulation. It was not used to indicate the kind of event in the way that we might associate it with from the 1970s onward. But I think it's really key to recognize that it was in circulation, and if you all leave today with one thing, you can go to dinner parties and tell people, actually the word Holocaust was circulating as early as 1945, 1946, 1947. Because it helps us really realize that there is a much longer history to not only the way these narratives were being told, but the terminology itself. The Citizens Committee further tied all of these narratives together, often calling displaced persons delayed pilgrims. And so they were not quiet about trying to integrate Holocaust survivors, displaced persons, into the narratives that America tells about itself. And it's not just the Citizens Committee, but a number of organizations that centered Holocaust survivors within the American narrative. So we can see here images with the Statue of Liberty welcoming Holocaust survivors into America, the idea that young, again, children were wanderers yesterday and Americans today, this kind of transformation of European displaced persons, of European Holocaust survivors into Americans was pretty widespread. And this list is from a number of radio broadcasts that directly applied the idea of delayed pilgrims to the stories of Holocaust survivors. And we're gonna listen to some of those in a little bit. The intersection of these ideas of America as a land of promise, of peace, of respite, and America as a land of plenty, the kind of material wonder of post-war period, was not limited to Jewish narratives. And you can see here is a multi-page spread from Life magazine in 1947 titled Orphans Clothed. It featured two young Holocaust survivors, Irene Gutman and Charles Caro. You can see them kind of seated in the center. And Charles and Irene were brought to New York by Rescue Children, an organization that was created specifically for post-war response by the United Orthodox Rabbis. And they were brought to the United States for a 10-day publicity blitz, specifically being kind of poster children for post-war aid. And they were the guests of honor at an annual gala in New Jersey. They were guests of President Truman at the White House, which was covered by the New York Times. And they were photographed around New York City in a variety of kind of posed scenarios for Life magazine, trying on new clothes, carrying stuffed animals, while gazing up at skyscrapers and grabbing their kind of white bread sandwiches. The images in Life were posed to focus specifically on the joys of American life and to celebrate those who sponsored the trip, much more so than to kind of preserve or tell the stories about these two young survivors in the images. And in fact, the accompanying article included no details at all about either of their wartime experiences, noting only that both of Irene's parents were exterminated in a concentration camp, and Charles's father was killed and his mother died of starvation. And in fact, Life reported that the sight of Irene and Charles at daily luncheons and parties has already touched so many hearts that donations to Busy Buddies, this organization in New Jersey, has jumped 30%. So again, like the idea that we might have of if we're going to feature Holocaust survivors, we're going to tell a story about what happened to them, it's really undermined in this article, that we have these beautiful images of life in America and a story about fundraising that celebrates American generosity. There's like a lot more to tell about Irene and Charles, so I hope that someone asks me in the questions and answers. But I'm actually going to switch gears and tell one kind of in detail final example to highlight both these dominant themes from post-war Holocaust narratives and to showcase some of the media formats that were used to disseminate these stories. So between 1946 and 1948, the story of Kurt Meyer, that's not Kurt Meyer, that's Paul Mooney, he's an actor, but the story of Kurt Meyer was publicly shared at least 3 times that I have been able to identify thus far. It's absolutely possible there are more out there. And the narratives reveal many of the themes that we've already introduced, centering the story of America, the need for American Jews to serve as saviors of the post-war period, advocacy for immigration reform, and the sense of optimism and freedom in America as a direct contrast to the experiences of Nazism. On April 6, 1947, the United Service for New Americans, an organization that kind of helped support and sponsor Jews coming to the United States, they sponsored a special Passover celebration that aired on the radio with the title Out of the Wilderness. Already, very evocative title. It's great for a Passover special. The broadcast featured 5 survivors of Nazi oppression, including Kurt Meyer, who at the time was already a well-known Czech pianist and survivor of Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Ohrdruf, and Buchenwald. The event's MC, David Timmons, welcomes Meyer to the stage. And I'm going to play 2 different clips from Out of the Wilderness. And I invite you to listen in particular for the accents. So thinking about the contrast between David Timmons as the announcer and then Kurt Meyer as the survivor, kind of hearing their different accents. And then also listening for what kind of information do we learn about the Holocaust? What kind of story would the listening audience have been able to learn? So this is the kind of introduction.
You've surely heard of our next guest. His story has been published far and wide in the United States by the same United Service that helped him to come to this country. His name is Kurt Meyer. Once his art was acclaimed, not only in his native land of Czechoslovakia, but throughout the world. Then the Nazis changed that world. The concert hall became the concentration camp. And the Nazis called upon Kurt Meyer to play when they shipped him to that terrible place called Auschwitz. Today, Mr. Meyer is here. He is the lone survivor of 86 persons in his family. Need we mention what his free, clean music means to him today?
So Timmons, that's the introduction to Meyer. Timmons juxtaposes the freedom of America with the oppression of the concentration camps and defines America as a haven of Jewish victims of Nazism. The following clip, Meyer directly addresses the audience. And I'm going to play a clip from his performance of My Yiddish Mama. You can see the music here. But I also want to note that before he played My Yiddish Mama, he also played 2 other songs, including Ich hab kein Heimatland, I Have No Homeland. And he notes specifically that we have sung this in the darkest hours in the various concentration camps, so that this performance is for all of us who went through the Nazi terror. So again, I urge you to listen to his accent, but also to think about that framing and how that's quite different from many of the other examples we've seen so far.
Kurt Meyer now plays as part of his celebration of a free Passover in America, an arrangement of Yiddish folk songs and songs of freedom. Mr. Meyer.
There are thousands of people brought here by the United Service who, just as I, lost their mothers during the Nazi persecution. In memory, I want to play the old familiar song, My Yiddish Mama.
So you can already start to hear some of these differences between this like American announcer voice and a kind of European accented voice of a survivor. And one of the things that's really interesting and curious about this time is that most survivors in Europe didn't speak English yet. And so the people who did find platforms like Mayer here were already exemplar, right? They spoke English, you can clearly understand him. He had a kind of artistic renown and was able to fit into a creative community once he came to the United States. But there's also this tension between the framing that Timmins gives his story, his performance, right, one of freedom, and the framing that Mayer gives it himself, which is really one of loss, remembering all of those who went through the Nazi terror. And these kinds of stories and these kinds of tensions continue to play out while Americans and these organizations are offering these positive, optimistic frameworks, and the survivors try to offer something quite different. In fact, we can kind of see that contrast when we look at the Life magazine article where there was no specificity about the post-war period against Mayer, who is now telling us about the loss of his mother. And in fact, we get a lot more of Mayer's story. In 1946, upon his arrival in New York, Mayer is interviewed by reporter Daniel Lang, and there is a multi-page story in the New Yorker that really details Mayer's story in the Holocaust, really in a way that we would recognize today. It's quite different than many of the other examples. But what's really interesting is that the framing that Lang offers to Mayer's story is one of the coming of the pilgrims. And again, he's explicitly trying to align Holocaust survivors and their coming to the United States with a longer history of America as haven. And I think this is particularly interesting right now in America to look back and think that the platform that Americans were using to advocate for Holocaust survivors to come to the United States was a shared understanding of America as haven, that America's role, their historical role, was to provide immigration pathways to people who needed it most. And that is exactly the kind of framework that Lang is offering to Mayer. The following year, the Citizens Committee on Displaced Persons narrativized Lang's article in a radio broadcast. And we're going to listen to some of that. Lang's article provided a detailed version of Mayer's experience under Nazism, published for national circulation. The radio broadcast similarly kinds of offers a longer Holocaust narrative, including particular story details that we would recognize as a Holocaust narrative today. And we also get this part at the beginning where Lang is interviewing Mayer, which sounds a lot like a Holocaust testimony today, right? And so there's these echoes of later contemporary Holocaust memory and Holocaust culture in this earlier time period. Okay, so Lang's article tracks Mayer from Karlovy Vary, Czechoslovakia, at the moment that the Germans are awarded the Sudetenland and the Munich Accords, and Mayer fled to Prague with his mother. They were both then deported to Theresienstadt, where they lived for about 2.5 years. Mayer's mother worked in the women's section there, sewing uniforms for the Germans until she was deported to Auschwitz. And soon after, Mayer was also deported to Auschwitz, where he learned that his mother had been sent directly to the gas chambers. At Auschwitz, we also learned that Mayer had been assigned to the camp band. So he avoided forced labor, but witnessed the lines of victims being sent to the gas chambers. Lang quotes Mayer as saying, quote, "The idea was for us to drown out their cries, but we never could." After 2 months at Auschwitz, Mayer was sent to Ohrdruf, a slave labor camp, where he worked on a V2 launching site until he was again transferred to play music. In February 1945, Mayer was sent to Sachsenhausen, where he worked in an underground airplane factory. And a few weeks later, he was forced on a death march to Buchenwald, where he was finally liberated in 1945. When the Citizens Committee on Displaced Persons dramatized this narrative, they included all of these details and this kind of journey that we might think about as a Holocaust narrative today. But instead, it focused again on displacement and the need for reformed immigration policy, while also depicting a specifically Jewish experience. So one of the things that the Citizens Committee and other kinds of organizations that were focused on non-Zionist immigration to the United States, they often undermine the Jewish specificity of the Holocaust. And so narratives that were circulating at this time often talked about war victims. There was a radio broadcast that a DP went up, he died in a displaced persons camp. He went up to the gates of heaven and asked to be placed into the American zone of heaven. And when and they brought a judge, the jury of whether or not he would be admitted into the United States zone of heaven was a set of American founding fathers who were appalled to find out that there was such a thing as quotas. And so there was this kind of like direct idea that America should be a place of haven and that Holocaust survivors should be afforded space within that. The radio drama was also titled Displaced, and it dramatized Mayer's story, again, to humanize this concept of displaced persons. I'm going to play two examples. Unlike Out of the Wilderness, we do not hear from Mayer at all. This is Kurt Mayer. Instead, the Citizens Committee hired Paul Mooney, an Academy and Tony Award-winning actor, to perform as Mayer. So Mooney was very well known at the time. He was also a very strong advocate for Holocaust survivors, including one of the primary speakers for Supplies for Overseas Survivors, the organization I showed you a little bit about earlier. He went to DP Europe and came back and gave speeches to raise money for all of these organizations. And nonetheless, it does raise a question about who is allowed to voice Holocaust survivors, who is allowed to perform and speak for survivors. And in 1947, they were absolutely not asking that question. But I think we all get to ask that question. And we get to listen to Mooney performing the accent he puts on and think about whether or not that is an appropriate way to tell the story. I would argue that a big part of studying this longer history of Holocaust memory is that there is no appropriate way to tell it, and that we kind of get the opportunity to think about what is the meaning behind these stories. What was the purpose of Mooney performing? Was he going to bring more attention to it? Was he going to allow more people to hear it and be excited by it and kind of participate in it? And we'll come back to that. So let's listen for the themes that we've heard. I'm going to start right at the beginning of the radio broadcast, and we can hear an actor performing as Lang, and then we can hear Mooney performing as Mayer.
Will you tell Mr. Meyer about the first time he thought of coming to America?
Well, I suppose the idea could have begun with the snapshots and postcards of Alice's. I recall back in 1938 I was playing the piano in Hotel Golden Archives in Talpa. That used to be my hometown. I was going there.
You don't want this, you just a little
Oh,
postcard.
yes, I want it. I want to take it with me, maybe.
It's just a
I
postcard.
know. But it's for my sister in America. It's a picture of the Empire State Building.
So the music in this broadcast, first of all, Mayer performed the music, so I think that's an interesting layer here. But the music performed within the broadcast. It indicated when the broadcast was jumping between time. So either we kind of started at the docks when Mayer disembarked from his ship, and then when it jumps back in time, we hear that music, and then at the end of the flashbacks, we hear that music again, so we jump back into the present of the film. I'm going to play the second clip as well, but remember that I noted that Lang's article, unlike so many other examples, detailed Mayer's experience under Nazism at multiple concentration camps and work camps. And this second clip dramatizes one of those experiences. But there's a really significant narrative change between Lang's article and the radio broadcast. In The New Yorker, Lang writes, "One afternoon when Mayer did not seem to be working fast enough, a guard wearing brass knuckles went to work on him and permanently scarred his chest." And we're about to hear that same scene in the radio broadcast version that transfers the punishment from Mayer to the man next to him. So let's listen and then we can kind of chat about that.
I was given a wheelbarrow and a pick and shovel and a lesson in what was expected of us by the poor fellow next to me. He fought in the dark, I must rest for just a moment.
Get moving!
Yes, I tried, but
You are here to work. If you can't work, you are no use to us. So, you, over there, don't stand there staring at me. Get back to work. There. Now get to work. And all of you.
So the music aside, the gunshot really exposes a narrative leap from Lang's article in the New Yorker to the radio broadcast. And there's no gunshot at all in the New Yorker article, suggesting that it was fabricated specifically for this audio moment, right? Taking advantage of the genre of audio to really raise the stakes of what was happening to Jews during Nazi Germany. And I would argue that this change is just one small example of how Holocaust narratives in the 1940s were not powerful because of their veracity. They were powerful because they revealed the fear and danger of Mayer's experience, and they provoked American listening audiences to understand the terror and the violence of Nazi Germany. And it was a very different but very real urgency that these organizations were responding to, not to preserve the specific memory and experience of individuals, again, but to activate American Jews who could respond in the post-war period. The Citizens Committee and Paul Mooney took seriously their role of imparting a message of social concern. And I'm gonna play one final audio clip. This is from the end of Displaced. So after the narrativized story, Paul Mooney speaks directly to the listening audience as Paul Mooney, and he calls on individual Americans to help. So here he drops his kind of performative accent, and he speaks directly not to the victims, but to the saviors. He kind of switches his angle.
whether they live to breathe the air of freedom and health and happiness or sink into despair and death is for us to decide. The choice is ours. In making that choice, we cannot permit ourselves to forget the story in the oldest and wisest of books of the man who fell among the thieves and was left by the side of the road to perish, and of how there were those who passed by on the other side and took no notice until there came that way a certain Samaritan who stopped to bind the man's wounds and give him comfort and compassion. Ladies and gentlemen, that is our choice today. The way of the Samaritan or of those who passed by on the other side. It is for us to choose, remembering that for that choice we stand accountable to our conscience and to God.
So by ending Displaced with Mooney's appeal, Kurt's story was explicitly put to the service of immigration advocacy. And Mooney called on Americans, not just American Jews, he kind of called from this Christian tradition of neighborliness, to invite all Americans to respond to this very Jewish crisis in post-war Europe. And we can feel the immediacy of that call as Kurt's story gives way to Mooney's appeal. And I chose to share the multiple representations of Mayer's story today because it highlights so many of the themes that I've identified from post-war communal narratives. Primary among them is that there is no one right way to tell Holocaust narratives in America. And in fact, Holocaust survivors, their voices, their narratives, their experiences were circulated widely in post-war America in many different forms of media, for many different audiences. They were part of the media landscape at the time in mainstream American spaces like the New Yorker and in more targeted materials like fundraising brochures. And yet the idea that there was silence after the war remains. The sense that survivors did not share their stories publicly, that American Jews were not listening, all of those ideas still remain, even as scholarship has kind of moved past them. And Saving Our Survivors argues that this burst of post-war experiences serves not to kind of correct that narrative that people maybe weren't hearing the stories that they would have wanted to hear later, but as a meaningful starting point for understanding the development of Holocaust memory in America, and a way for us to better see the gaps in our collective engagement with the Holocaust. Transformations not only in the stories themselves, but in the technologies used to capture them and share them, and in the themes centered, and in particular in the role that survivors played, going from the periphery to the center in how we tell and understand stories about the Holocaust today. We are reminded that the narratives we take in, whether they are those from testimony collections, movies, personal interactions with survivors, online videos, VR content, AI, computational content, all of these narratives are created by institutions or sponsored by institutions. They are mediated by technologies. They are created for purposes, and they are historically bound to the moment in which they are created. The technologies available to these institutions are changing, but these narratives, just like the ones in the post-war period, were crafted with care and concern for the pressing issues of the day. Expanding our understanding of the history of the Holocaust narrative in America, the creation and narrativization of the Holocaust helps us better understand and trace the messy, diffuse, and ongoing nature of narrative construction, not only about the Holocaust, but also about each new tragedy we confront and how we tell the stories of new events in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that wonderful talk and wonderful introduction to your book. In a moment, I'll open it up for questions, so start formulating your questions, but I'll ask a question or two to get us started, if that's okay. One of the things that I really appreciate most about your book, as I mentioned to you earlier, is that you take a very, I'd say, non-cynical, generous approach to the materials that you study, right? So that, when you dig into areas such as fundraising, where the agenda would seem to be far from promoting Holocaust memory or understanding of the Holocaust, or the effort to Americanize and assimilate Holocaust survivors, it seems to me it would be easy to be cynical about those efforts, but you're not, and I think that that really is the heart of the book in a sense. And you make a case for the value of these sources, and it was wonderful to see the pictures in large format and to hear the radio programs as well. So I wondered if you could just say a bit about your methodology and about your stance toward the materials that you're looking at.
Thank you for that question. I think this is on. Yeah? Okay. For a long time, I think I was worried that just by personality, I was not being critical enough. And I think there's a set of faces over here that would probably agree with the earlier versions were not critical enough. But over time, I really came to feel more confident in the sense that these people who were crafting these narratives, the people who were in post-war Europe, who were doing humanitarian work, who were coming back to the United States, touring the country, fundraising, they had good intentions. So at the time, the most urgent need was to help the survivors in Europe. The only way that was going to happen was through an unprecedented scale of humanitarian response. And it is easy, I think, to be cynical about some of the radio in particular, right? To hear the way these narratives are discussed, to hear that music paired with these really kind of big, troubling stories. But I also think about our response to humanitarian crises today, and maybe if everybody just wants to think about one humanitarian aid work that you did. I know there's so many food banks collecting right now. If everybody, I don't know, our kids' school is collecting food, our synagogue is collecting food, everything is collecting food. And I think that we give and participate in these humanitarian acts with good intentions. And I think it's worth unpacking what kinds of knowledge we're building about world events through our participation in those acts. And sometimes it's none, but there's something happening that we care enough to participate. And there was something happening in post-war America that American Jews cared enough to participate at an unprecedented scale. And so the narratives were being used, I would argue, that they were being used to motivate that kind of extra care and participation. And I do think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, no, and I think that sort of looking at those figures of fundraising and saying, okay, this is a response to a particular narrative, I actually think that's a really interesting way of thinking about the power of narratives.
Yeah, I think earlier historical kind of takes on this period was that American Jews were acting out of guilt, and that the scale was really only a response to guilt of what could have happened if they'd done this during the war. But I don't think that really captures a response at the scale in which this participation was happening. And so if we look at how much action was happening, how many people were participating, and some of the kind of fervor of the narrative, I think there's more to it, and I do think it's about the power of narrative and image that was circulating at the time.
And do you have a sense for how the survivors themselves felt about these stories that were being crafted about them? Because as you point out, and it's very clear from your examples, the survivors, I mean, sometimes we get a survivor's voice, but mostly we're not getting a very direct access to the survivors themselves, and they're being framed and narrated by others. And as you said, they've, over the course of time, have kind of moved from the margins to the center of the story, which seems appropriate. So I'm just curious, like, if we have evidence of what, especially in these early cases, survivors thought about what was being done with their stories.
Yeah, so unfortunately, Mayer died somewhat young, so he was not around to kind of give his testimony to places like Shoah or to Yale or to the Holocaust Museum. So I have to just assume that he agreed to participate because he created the music. He participated in these narratives and in these productions. But the story of Irene and Charles, I think, is a much more helpful example to think about this long history. So Irene and Charles, those two young children in the Life magazine article, there's a fair amount of archival evidence of what happened to them afterwards, and so we're able to trace them for a longer period of time. They were both told by the people who were leading rescue children that they would be brought back to Europe after the war. And Irene in particular really wanted to go back to France because she wanted to emigrate to Palestine with a friend of hers. So she really wanted to go back and be with her friends. And instead, the organizers of rescue children felt that they couldn't bring these children back to the depravity of Europe after they had experienced the wonder of America. And so they were both adopted to American Jewish families, both of whom then were able to also bring over each of their siblings. So Irene was adopted by a family. Her twin brother, Rene, was brought over in the early 1950s. And in the many decades since, Irene has become a very vocal Holocaust survivor. She goes to local schools to talk about her experience. She has 3 different testimonies recorded by the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And she, in 2005, created a documentary about her and her twin brother. Now, you may have guessed from the twin brother clue, Irene was a Mengele twin at Auschwitz. And there is no way that story would have ever been known from that Life magazine story. And so the reality of her experience was totally obscured from this story. But she became later in her life somebody who advocated for herself, who wanted to tell her story, who felt like it really mattered to share that story. Charles, on the other hand, I was not able to find a record of him after his bar mitzvah invitations went out to the leaders of rescue children. That was like the end of the archival record. And then last year, when news started circulating that my book was getting published, I got an email from Charles's son-in-law who said, "Hey, we found your dissertation online and we read about my father-in-law and we would love for you to tell us more because he's told us some stories but he doesn't like to talk about it, and he told us that he met President Truman but we don't believe him." And so last year I got to have a Zoom with Charles, and he did not want to talk about his Holocaust experience at all. And his daughter and son-in-law kept trying to redirect our Zoom conversation, which if you've had these experiences, you know is not that uncommon. But what he did want to tell me about was that he became a professional tennis player after his Life in America, which his daughter and son-in-law would not let me ask questions about. So there's this really great, really interesting generational tension. But what I think is even more curious in this example is that Charles told me that in 1998, I might have that date wrong, Life magazine did a reunion article. They brought Charles and Irene back together. And they asked them about their experience, and Charles said he loved it. He remembers being so excited by all the food, by all the sandwiches, by all the new things, and Irene remembers it as being horribly traumatic, that she was brought into this dressing room and she was told to take off her clothes, and it was a really terrible experience for her. And so I think there's this really interesting long history that we get to better understand the nuances and complexities of Holocaust memory over this period by even just looking at these two individuals. And if we start in the 40s, it gets much more complicated.
Wow, those are fascinating stories. That's really great. Thank you. Let me open up for questions. I see one already.
Thank you for all the research you do. I you a question. Is there a different response after these pictures of children and then the people coming on the train and looking healthy, and then see actual photographs of what happened to people in the camps? How many years is there between those horrible photographs that are unbelievable and these pictures of survivors?
It's such a good question because they were actually happening at the exact same time. So there's a chapter in the book where I look specifically at the kind of symbols of trains and think about, from our contemporary perspective today, when we imagine the role of trains in the Holocaust, we think about them as the kind of pillar of dehumanization, right? That the kind of way that Jews were brought to concentration camps, they were taken out of their lives. And those narratives, those pictures were circulating in post-war America. In particular, the American army was capturing footage as they liberated concentration camps, and the army was creating these little short films, and they were being aired before any movie across all of America. So if you went to the cinema in 1945, 1946, 1947, you were seeing these kinds of short films with images from the perspective of liberators. So you were seeing exactly the kinds of images that you were referring to. And at the same time, American Jews were getting these fundraising narratives in their house. They were getting these annual reports that had like that image of the train, of trains being one of joy and celebration that Jews were leaving Europe. So they were actually happening right on top of each other. And as one of the things that I think is most curious, that American Jews at the time were really holding both of those meanings for these kinds of symbols at the time.
Yeah, the juxtaposition of the two different kinds of trains is really quite an amazing thing. Thanks, yeah. Yes, in the front.
Today we have, television, the internet, other things. But between 1945 and 53, I guess it would mainly be magazines like Life, newspapers, the newsreels, and radio. And of all those mediums, which do you think had the most effect, was most effective in bringing response to help, to get the kind of help they want?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that in terms of scale, the impact around fundraising was the most, right? So if we think about the amount of money people were raising, there's records of, so if anyone's been to a Federation event in a while, the practice of standing up to give your donation at higher than you did last year, that started in this period. They were creating all of these new strategies to get people to give at greater and greater amounts every year. And so I think it was like we're gonna throw all the spaghetti at the wall kind of strategy. Like we're gonna send the brochures, and we're gonna have posters, and we're gonna have that on the radio, and we're gonna have a speaker come and talk to you. So it was really about everything. I would also say that for the material aid campaigns, one of the most effective methods of inspiring giving was letters directly from either people's rabbis who were now serving as chaplains in the war, or their sons or their nephews. What happened with the material aid campaigns was that these letters were coming from post-war Europe before the organizations could even get the campaigns off the ground. Letters from chaplains, letters from sons who were part of the Liberation Army were writing home and saying, we need, clothes, we need medicine, we need books, we need things. And so that really prompted a lot of the immediate material aid. So it was, I don't think I would put one on top of the other. They were all really effective broadly.
In the way back, yeah. Yes, you. Yeah.
So I was wondering, thank you, that was great. I was wondering about how the non-Jewish communities in America responded to this. I remember I was reading this book about an African-American communist woman named Tyra Edwards. You Google her name, you find the book, and she was married to a Jewish man who worked for the American Joint Distribution Committee, and after World War II and the Holocaust, she moved to Italy and was involved in helping Jewish orphans there. So that just stuck with me. I'm curious about the different responses, whether in terms of support, and also if there was anti-Semitic backlash against efforts to promote Jewish immigration to the U.S.
I would say yes to all of that. So I'm going to start with how did non-Jews get involved in these campaigns. So some of the campaigns were specifically for Jews, right? People who were members of Hadassah, for example, would participate in member events, and they would kind of have discussions, and there were communications that went directly to members, and those were for Jewish audiences. There were people like Martha Sharp, who is recognized as at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, but there were some people who were outside the Jewish community who were directly involved in material aid. They kind of looked around and saw this as a humanitarian crisis and got involved directly. But some of the campaigns were meant to kind of invite in neighbors or invite in non-Jews, and just two examples. So there were these campaigns, many of the organizations would create an annual film, and the film would kind of support the fundraising campaign of the year. And then the central organization out of New York would rent out not only the film, but the film projector. And so, like, let's say you wanted to invite your neighbors over, you could play this film, or you could play a film strip, and then you could read the script that came with the film script. So there were these structures in place to actually allow Jews to bring in their non-Jewish neighbors into some of these campaigns. And then the other thing is the supplies for overseas survivors. I mean, the record of how they advocated for supplies for overseas survivors is so broad. Like, they had life-size cutouts at the grocery store. They had summer camp campaigns. They had, like, dance nights at summer resorts. It was so vast that is one of the campaigns that invited in a lot of non-Jewish neighbors as well. And the fact that the federal government or the national government was also having material aid campaigns, it was really broad and part of a post-war effort to also get people to clean out their closets and buy new clothes. So there's like this really interesting post-war participation that was like undergirded by consumerism, but it's like a different story. Yeah.
In the blue shirt, and then Todd.
You talked about pressure to change the immigration.
Yeah.
Do the immigration laws actually change?
They did, but not until after Israel was created as a state. So after the primary pressure of immigration from Europe had been kind of released, then the United States changed their immigration policies, which allowed more people to come in.
Todd, you want to?
Okay, I thought you were.
Oh, sorry. Todd and then Sarah. We'll get everybody.
All right. First, I want to congratulate you on such an extraordinary book and project, and it's just remarkable to think that not only was it the product of, obviously being here at UCLA, getting your PhD, but that it continues up until this past year with the research. Because I think, and it's also that the project speaks to many contemporary concerns, not least all the historiographic ones you raised around sort of thinking about memory and testament of the Holocaust. But I wanted to ask you about the particular example you showed us today, or heard, the Kurt Meyer example, which is fascinating as an example of testimony, because the questions of aestheticization that are so important in the 1990s and 2000s, like limits of representation, adding to the historical record. In this case, you have very early on years of performance by an actor. They add music, they add gunshots. He's playing, kind of transitional time travel music. There's some really interesting aestheticization questions happening, and it's right there at the very beginning, right? And so it changes in some ways the way we think about these later debates around limits of representation. So I just wondered if you could speak to that issue in whatever fashion you wish.
Yeah, thank you so much. My work with you really offsets so many of these questions. I think that the question of aesthetics in this post-war period are really curious because there's also a lot of films being created, some of which are up for the short film Oscar. And so there is a kind of intentionality around how these narratives are not only being edited and created, but then also being circulated. And the Kurt Meyer one, I think it's also about practicing the genre norms at the time. So March of Time was a very popular radio broadcast throughout the war, and it had grown in not only in popularity but also in authority, right? So people would turn to March of Time for news during the war, and it kind of created this combination of news reporting, but then also dramatization. So this idea that dramatization could be an authentic way to understand what was happening in the world was kind of more widely understood. I do think it's interesting that the kind of loss of that early period of this kind of experimentation or kind of a lack of norms, we might say, about how to tell these stories is part of the myth of silence, right? So that when historians or scholars or Jewish community members in the 1980s and 90s look back and they said, well, there's nothing that looks like what we think Holocaust narrative looks like, so no one must have been talking about it. And I think it helps to minimize what was happening at the time. And I would hope that if we add these materials into the Archive of Holocaust Memory, if we add them into how we think about Holocaust memory, it really helps us challenge some of those limitations, especially as we move forward, because as your work shows, computation is not slowing down the possibilities for representation. It's kind of wildly opening them up. So I think we need to kind of take each new technology iteration on its own terms to some sense.
There's another interesting book that just came out in the last year or so by Catherine Brackney about the sort of surreal aesthetics of early Holocaust representation, where she's also making, it's a very different book in so many ways, but like also making the case that there's just a whole different aesthetic at play before you get this more standardized, post-Shoah, notion of what a good, what a serious Holocaust representation is supposed to look like. In some ways, it makes an interesting companion piece, I think.
Yeah, there was a film that was created in 1948 called My Father's Home, and it was filmed in Israel, so it's filmed in 48, 49. And it was a group of young Holocaust survivors who'd made their way from Europe to Israel. They were living kind of communally. It wasn't quite a kibbutz, but they were like living communally in Israel. And they created this film, and they like recreated a concentration camp like on their land so that they could dramatize their own experiences. And the film, it's very surreal. They kind of layer on these images on top of each other. So there's kind of barbed wire on top of these young people, and it is very surreal. That was in the dissertation. That part didn't make it into the book. But yeah, the aesthetics is a jam. Thank you for adding that.
Yeah, fascinating. Sarah, and then in the front. Yeah.
Well, I echo Todd's gracious comments about how exciting it is to see this work take this new and I would also say like incredibly crystallized and distilled form. So congratulations. So you've been helping me, and I've been thinking a lot about the kinds of storytelling that is being given in DP camps by survivors, and obviously before the DP camps close. And it strikes me that in many cases, the survivors are speaking to American representatives of UNRWA in the DP camps, and maybe those materials are being read by American consulates or being approved by American consulates before visas are being given. I'm not exactly sure about that point, but in some ways, it's actually the first American audience of storytelling by these survivors. And you make the point in your book that you and others don't consider this testimony because it's not a formal testimony gathering enterprise. But it does strike me that it absolutely conforms to everything you said in your conclusion, that they are stories being crafted in particular ways for particular ends. So I'm wondering about that distinction of formal testimony and how you start, do you leave this project rethinking the chronology of when testimony actually begins and what might be kind of problematized and examined within that frame?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question. And maybe just as an addendum, I started the research thinking I would find exactly those kinds of narratives that Holocaust survivors were going to give their case to an immigration officer or someone in Europe as a way to get into the United States. And I could never find them, and now you have found some, so that's exciting. I think for me, testimony is really about a survivor's intentionality and agency about how they tell their story, who they're telling it to. and the role that they get to play in their own personal experience. And so I would say that projects like David Boder's in 1948 would be an early example of testimony. Because he sits down with an individual survivor and he keeps correcting them if they try to say like, oh, well, my brother saw this or my sister told me this. And he's like, no, I only want to hear what you saw. I mean, it's very rude about it. But so there's something that, to me, there's something very specific about an individual survivor telling their story from their perspective and their experience and the agency they use to tell that story. A lot of these post-war narratives, especially the formalized ones, and I don't know if you've found this yet, but I don't have like a great example of this, but I found this set of like, unclear if it was like English language practice from a class or if it was letters for these adoption programs, but there's a set of letters of Polish children in a Polish orphanage after the war, and they're all exactly the same. The only thing that has changed is their name. And so I think for a lot of these formalized narratives, especially ones that got people into a DP camp or got them, the formal passage for visas, things like that, there was like a whisper network around like, what story do you tell to get what you need to get where you want to go? And so to me, that's like not quite testimony because it lacks the kind of agency that survivors had later to tell their own stories in their own way, which we could argue about as well, I guess, but yeah.
Here and then here, yeah.
I possibly misunderstood you, and if I did, I apologize. But did you make reference to some of the people that supported rescuing Jews were actually anti-Zionists?
Yes.
So could you elaborate, Jewish anti-Zionism, American anti-Zionism, that's nothing new, that's been for decades?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, well, this is definitely not my area of expertise, but there are some really great books about it. In fact, it's American Zionisms, is that the name of the book? That kind of traces the history of like all these different ways that Zionism has been thought and rethought in American Jewish life. It goes back, so I would recommend kind of looking at that book. I would say in this context, there was a set of Jewish organizations that were non-Zionist from before the war, and that ideology and that belief kind of continues in the post-war period and really pushes them to advocate, instead of immigration for survivors to Israel, it pushes them to advocate for changed immigration policies in the United States that would provide Holocaust survivors with an avenue to come legally to the United States. And so the way that it plays out in these narratives is that because all of them get funds from, at the time, the UJA, which we might think about like a federation umbrella today, there's fundraising campaigns that are representing survivors as pioneers in Israel, as victims in Europe, as new Americans. There's kind of like a diffusion, I would say, of representation. And I think that's part of what makes this period really interesting in terms of, and complex in terms of how survivors are being represented, precisely because these different organizations are advocating for different things.
Thanks. Yeah, over here.
If I'm not mistaken, when you first began, or your introduction, you said something, I think, that at a certain period, the emphasis or the ask was for Israel.
Yes.
The new state of Israel.
Yes.
Is that why this goes up to 1953, or
yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Great question. Sure. Yes. So one of the things that's happened, this is like maybe too in the weeds, but I'll go there anyway. So in 1945, the UJA, they've been raising money for all these organizations, right? In 1945, they fell apart. Their fundraising campaign falls apart because the United Palestine Appeal, which raises money for Jewish life in Palestine, and the Joint Distribution Committee, which raises money for Jewish life in Europe, they can't agree on how much each should get. And they raise so little money separately that they decide pretty quickly that they're going to come back together. And so in 1946, when they raise that ridiculous $100 million, JDC gets 60% and the UPA gets 40%. In 1948, that changes, and the United Israel Appeal gets 60%, and then from that period on, the United Israel Appeal is really the majority, getting the majority of the money. And JDC, in fact, changes a lot of their campaign programs to focus on Israel as well. But what happens in 1953 is that, so now there's been 5 years, 4.5 years, in which survivors in Europe can legally immigrate to Israel. And by 1953, most of the displaced persons camps are closed. So that's why the project kind of wraps up in 1953. One of the things that I found is that by 1954, 55, 56, so now again, there's not really a lot of displaced persons camps left. There's like a couple. But most of the Jews have kind of found where they're going to be, not quite their like life post-war, but they have found where they might be. And the fundraising campaigns continue to draw on narratives from the Holocaust. So even while the campaign materials, the campaign projects, all of the work is happening in Israel, the symbols and have kind of crystallized around survivors. So you continue to see and hear about the ghettos of Europe. You continue to see images of people with tattoos on their arms. You continue to see barbed wire. All of these images that have inspired donation. I think that the power of the images are so successful that they continue into this post period as well.
That was for Israel.
Yeah, exactly, for Israel.
Focus more on Israel,
Yeah.
even though they use those images.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, over here.
Could you talk about how American Jews first learned of the Holocaust during the war?
Yeah. So it's a good question. I have not traced these organizations in this close way back into the war, but UJA was campaigning during the war. The challenge of that time was that the Jewish organizations couldn't get into the places where things were happening. So the images of survivors, the images of concentration camps, those don't start coming out until 1945. There are some narratives that are circulating at the time. So especially Jews who were able to escape during the earlier period of Nazi Germany, they go on fundraising tours across America too, for UJA, for JDC. So they're trying to do what they can. There's a JDC office in Portugal and a JDC office in Switzerland that are like trying their best to implement aid as best they can. And so they're organizing and fundraising for them. But the communal narratives at that time don't have images or stories to pull from other than the German Jews who'd left prior to the Holocaust starting.
I think we have time for one more question right there. Yes, Professor.
It's a version of the previous question, and I think it's about Henry Luce.
Oh, great.
And I was really struck by calling him in the cover of Life magazine. And so I was thinking about what Life allowed to be published,
Mm-hmm.
what Life had not allowed to be published before 1945, and whether questions like the question of whether we learned about the Mengele twins or not
Yeah.
really come down to non-Jewish executives deciding what's best for America as a whole.
Yeah.
Is this something that you have considered?
It's not something I have looked into. Is absolutely true, right? I think the other thing that's interesting, one of the reasons radio is this really productive space, is that in the earlier 1930s, the FCC implements a rule where radio, for every, I'm not going to get the numbers right, but for every X amount of hours of commercial broadcast, they had to have X amount of hours of non-commercial broadcast. So organizations, Jewish, non-Jewish, all kinds of organizations start creating radio broadcasts because suddenly all of these radio stations have to fill all this time. And so there are, a number of radio shows that are kind of filling it in specifically because they have to. And so I think, who's making these final decisions and what makes sense for their audience is absolutely part of this picture. But because I've focused primarily on Jewish organizations, I haven't looked at the decision making more broadly. One thing just to add to that though is that Magnum Photos was owned and founded by Jews, and so the photos that were taken were often kind of within a Jewish frame. So that's even before the war as well. So there were a lot of images from like pre-war Europe of Jewish spaces. So it wasn't that there wasn't content or media. It was really about exactly like you say, the decision making of people who were publishing and circulating materials.
Okay, well, I can only recommend this book. It's a wonderful book, and I think there's some flyers in the back, so look out for those, and join me in thanking once again Rachel Deblinger.